You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Kins, your host as always. This week we're going to do another suburb spotlight focusing on Mount Hawthorne. We're going to have a chat with an agent who's been there and done that in Melbourne and is now grassroots in Mount Hawthorne. As an update on the market, we saw a pretty quiet week actually over Easter with the 4-day break. People clearly have taken a bit of a holiday, even with fuel prices being high. Transactions, stock on market still sitting in the 3,000s. Median days on market still at 9 days, there's still lots to talk about when it comes to supply and the recent policy decision from the Cook government with regards to underwriting apartment development finance is a really good step that we won't see a lot of impact with for a number of years, but is certainly the sort of policies we want to talk about in the future, and I'll make sure we cover that going forward. But to get to today's topic, we have one man to chat to. It's Hamish Laidlaw, Director at Acton Bell, Mount Hawthorne. Hamish, thanks for coming in, mate.
Thanks for having me.
Melbourne property.
Yeah.
So many things to talk about before we talk about Mount Hawthorne, but
Absolutely.
One thing we have referenced a couple of times now on the podcast is with Lockie Delahunty recently as well, who's a bit of an advocate for that part of town, given he grew up there, is the possible shift of investment strategy and opportunity to Melbourne. He's pushing his clients there as well as still Perth and a couple of other cities. I thought it'd be nice to have a chat with an agent who actually knows what's going on the ground in Melbourne from a sales perspective, understands the contract side, and can give us a bit of a flavour as to how buying in Melbourne might be different to buying in Perth. First question, I guess, is when I rock up to a home open, what's the difference?
The home open itself is probably the same, I would say. Same as 2 agents, but the space between time is longer. So it's an auction campaign. It's always 4 weeks. I worked Fitzroy, so it was very much in a city. Midweek home open would be 1 p.m.
Yeah, wow. So you take your lunch break?
Yeah, corporate people coming at 1 p.m. Then you'd have your Saturday, and it would be 2 a week. Very similar to here, but here would be big on after hours. You do 5:30 to 6. Very big corporate, inner city, people buying those sort of properties.
What would that happen? Is that just weed out the serious players and identify them?
Yeah, definitely. Weed out the serious players, identify who your key, and obviously with an auction process, you're trying to gauge where the market is to set that reserve, and you're essentially trying to gauge how many people you're going to have come to the auction. So having that 1 o'clock on a Thursday is a really easy way of filtering it out. And often in Melbourne, they'll put every home open time up until the auction.
And that's such a different experience to Perth, where, especially the last couple of years, that FOMO space is forcing people to make a decision on their future home that they may be in for the next 30 years in the space of a quick 15 minutes in and out. There's 40 other people in the place. You really haven't checked every nook and cranny. There's no way you could. And you're putting an offer down 10-20% more than you thought you would have had to cash on somewhere that you wouldn't even know where the retick box is. It's a different experience to having 4 weeks to really think it through and decide whether you're a serious buyer at auction day.
100%. Yeah, that's a big difference. I've seen the market I worked in Melbourne was not as bullish as it has been in Perth. So I think the stock levels were a lot higher there. So even in Perth, if our stock levels grew to that 10,000 mark, you need 4 weeks to maximise that exposure, to have people coming through and actually seeing all the properties on the market. But that rule of thumb, regardless of how many properties you had, competing properties, it was always 4 weeks, including the auction. So 3 weeks of home opens, auction day on the 4th week.
Now, when you think about auctions in Perth, and we've covered this a couple of times in the 385 episodes we've had, but auctions really are reserved for crazy agents or properties that essentially sold themselves. And so the auction would be used to get people super emotional on the day and try and increase the value of the sale price further than what a private treaty would.
Yeah.
Not many people have the balls or the interest to go into auction in Perth in any other circumstance. But with, as you said, in Melbourne, nearly every property goes to auction, and we know why, because of sunset clauses and just the culture that's come around that. But
laws are different.
what happens in Melbourne when you're in a dog of a market like it is now. It's like Perth 2018 feel, and you got a clearance rate of 55%. Are you still going to auction?
The auction becomes a tool for the owners at that point.
So conditioning?
It's a conditioning
Because it's a
tool.
bit of an awkward situation when no one rocks up and you're all standing around.
Yeah.
With
Look,
your hands in your pocket.
with the REWA forms in the East Coast, which I do notice some people that have lived on the East Coast when signing authorities here get confused with. But with a private sale, there is a box when you're filling out the authority with a private sale, essentially like your reserve price. There's a box in there, and if you get above that price, you're entitled to a fee.
Got you. So
Right.
they're incentivized to sell.
Incentivized to sell, right? And so when you're listing, you're going through comparable data, and hence a seller that is listing something private sale that hasn't been through that auction process, because of that factor, has a tendency to have, for obvious reasons, to have that price on that private sale authority a lot higher. Whereas with an auction authority, it's TBA. So there is no price, and it's the auction process that is going to determine what the price is. And in a softer market that Melbourne's seeing right now, would be essentially to condition the owner, in some cases to run an auction and have nobody bid.
So that's just part of the...
That's part of the selling journey, and that would be a 4-week discovery, which as a motivated seller, this just sounds horrible as well, but as a motivated seller, you're rocking up on auction day and no one's putting their hand up. It's a pretty powerful tool to get you in line to where the market is.
I guess what it does is it probably avoids a situation which Perth saw of a property sitting on the market for 90, 120 days because no one's really just tapped a seller on the shoulder and said, look, mate, these are the facts. An auction does that for you after 28 days, right?
100%. Yeah. And you've got weekly campaign meetings where you're basically educate. Look, it's easier to list auction as well because that education piece around pricing is probably a little less intense because a lot of that happens throughout the 4 weeks, and it's really
You nearly know by auction day where it's going.
and you're sitting down and setting reserve before the auction hits. Yeah.
Got ya. So as some advice to Perth listeners, and we're all about Perth buyers here, protecting Perth buyers. If you are going to buy in Melbourne, and I am not advocating for doing that, I have not been an advocate to this point, and I'm still not for buying in Melbourne. I haven't been proven that Melbourne is actually going to have an upswing anytime soon. Just because it goes down doesn't mean it automatically comes up. It has to be economic, immigration reasons, supply reasons, why, and I haven't seen them yet. But if someone was going to go and buy a property in Melbourne, would the advice be to let it get to auction, let it fall over, and then be the first guy to call and say, I'll give you X?
Yes, depending on why you were buying the property. If you absolutely love the property and you were moving from Perth to Melbourne and you wanted to secure it to live in, I would suggest, if the auction was completely dead, you would put in a bid, because then that gives you exclusive rights there and then on the day to negotiate with the seller. I probably wouldn't suggest just completely leaving it, because then it becomes a private sale and you're subject to all the same things we have here in our private treaties, whereby there is no transparency, so you don't have anything. I personally think auctions for buyers are just such a good way to buy property.
That's a big call for someone, obviously, who's back in Perth and selling property in Perth.
Yeah.
Is it a method that you get the opportunity to sell within Perth since you've been home?
I wouldn't advise it to any of my sellers, no.
Why?
Because the FOMO that is created in this marketplace, it's just not right for an auction. So some case studies I've done, so I actually purchased 2 properties on behalf of clients in recent times in the last year. Both of them were purchased dramatically under what my clients would have paid for them. One was in Leadville. They were prepared to go up to 2.1. It was a bit of a unique property. I did a bit of due diligence and it was a high ones, subject to what would happen on the day. We bought it for 1.93.
At auction?
At auction.
Yeah, so does that talk to the reality that I see that Perth buyers just don't like being a part of auction? They don't trust it. They don't enjoy it.
Yeah.
They're not conditioned to enjoy it. It's an awkward situation for most of us. I don't feel comfortable personally at an auction, right?
Yeah.
So is that why you think people just don't rock up? They go, I don't want to be a part of this.
Yeah, I think it's not familiar enough here. Also in Melbourne, when I first moved here, I didn't understand. I was like, what is this, subject to finance for 28 days? It's like, this is crazy. Everyone is completely pre-approved and they waiver their finance clause. So I think that's a big scare point for a lot of people, is the fact that it is completely unconditional. Yes, in Melbourne, there is a 3-day cooling off. If something untoward happens here and
you could pull finance anyway.
You can pull finance.
Yeah. It is a little bit of a sort of fugazi these days.
It is.
Subject to finance. It used to be a situation where you needed to get a bona fide bank decline. Not anymore. You just get your broker to email the sales agent and go, sorry, dude, not happening.
Not happening.
What is that?
Yeah. I had a property over a year ago in Sorrento. 7 offers on it, was negotiating with the 2nd offer. I said, look, we need to go in at the number that you're happy to lose it for now. Like, you've missed out on 6 properties. You're in 2nd position. Now is your chance. So I'm seeing the owners tomorrow. They jumped up 110 grand. Right. Everyone was hovering around 175, 176. Yeah. Now, if that was an auction,
they wouldn't have had to.
No, they would have jumped up to 178.
Because whilst auctions do have their benefits of creating that FOMO environment as well, and the level of energy that comes with it, private treaty and the smoke and mirrors that come with it, a very skilled agent has the ability to be able to extract some pretty serious gaps. And as long as valuations stack up, if there's finance involved, then you can certainly change people's lives in that situation.
Definitely. And I do believe if Perth buyers become more comfortable with auctions and our stock levels extrapolate, I think an auction's not a bad, if there's less FOMO, right? And in a suburb you've got 7 similar homes on the market and yours is an auction, I would be a little bit more privy to that. If it was a really unique home, there was 7 other properties that were, so say you had a unique 4x2 in Mount Hawthorne and there was 7 other 4x2s not quite as unique, but you need a little bit more space for buyers to come through all of those properties. And I think an auction in that market in Perth, I would suggest, for clients, I'm always very client focused, and I say that a lot of the time to clients, buyers are going to buy if they like the house. It doesn't matter what terminology you put up there, they'll
find a way.
They'll find a way. So I think finding a method that the client is comfortable with is the most important for me. If we were in that scenario and there were 7 properties that were quite similar on the market, my client said to me, Hamish, I'd really like to do an auction. I think it's a really transparent way of going. I'd say, absolutely, let's go. If they said that to me now, I'd say I'd highly recommend you not to.
Yeah,
because there's no other property like yours on the market. So there's no need to drag it on for 3 weeks. It's just opening ourselves up to more properties that could potentially come on, buyers we may lose, uncertainty, any new report that comes out, you lose a buyer. So, yeah, not my preferred method at this moment in time.
What would your preferred method be in Melbourne right now if you were to go buy an investment property?
So I was there last Easter, and I'm probably the opposite to you because I looked at properties that I had sold, very similar in Collingwood. There was one particularly for sale in Collingwood, and I'd sold on the street, and it was a 2x1 weatherboard cottage, and it was 1.2. I saw it on the market. They have ranges. It was 9 to 990. And I was like, I've never seen that before.
Yeah.
I've never actually physically sold something similar.
That cheap.
And then seen a similar, but we'd flown back for Easter. It'd been 5 years since I'd been back. So that gets me excited. Yes, the laws and the government and everything, all the back end stuff may not be there, but I think that some more growth is there to happen. But, you know, that property's been to auction. If it's there with a range on it, 9 to 990, it's been to auction. It hasn't sold, and it's sitting there. Those are the ones that I would look at.
Yeah, in this market, you can afford to take your time.
Take your time.
And choose. Be picky and choosy.
Yeah.
And I guess the point I would make on that is that the way I look at it right now is it's discounted 3-day-old bread. It does look cheap compared to what you could have bought it for when it was fresh and it was new, but that doesn't mean it's going to get better anytime soon. And so it should be cheaper because the environment has changed. Affordability is different. The physical space is different to what it is, and it has readjusted. So, yeah, cycles generally do oscillate down and then up and then down, but how long are you going to be sitting in the down for whilst you could have been buying in Perth?
Yeah,
and that's probably the conversation I continually have in my head if I was someone who is looking at buying between Perth and Melbourne. And then you just got to essentially decide how easy is it to buy in Perth versus Melbourne. And that's why we'll segue on to Mount Hawthorne, because Mount Hawthorne represents an aspirational suburb, one that reflects a suburb like Fitzroy, as well. And it's a beautiful cafe strip, leafy green space that I think most people would love their life in. And it's one that therefore at the moment would be receiving some of the most pressure from aspirational people our age, to be honest, who really wish they could get in. And as long as their mortgage broker allows them, would do everything they could.
Definitely.
So what is the reality in Mount Hawthorne right now? Who are the people buying right now? How would you typify them if you had 10 buyers walk through the door? Describe them to me.
There's two categories of buyers and two defined markets in Mount Hawthorne. There's that entry level, which is now really 1.6 to 1.7. I sold one on Anzac Road for just shy of 1.7 a week and a half ago, and that was set. There was 7 buyers coming through. It was a 2x2, but it's land holding, character home, Mount Hawthorne. Every single one of those buyers were second home buyers looking to get into the area.
Late 30s.
Couples,
small kid.
Couples, kid on the way,
Sheepdog.
small kid. Yeah. That's who the buyers were. Then there's the other side of things, whereby you have the fully finished, like I had one on the
Forever home. Yeah.
Forever home. Now, the funny thing about Mount Hawthorne, that it attracts two types of buyers to that. The first is it attracts a huge amount of people that have bought in Mount Hawthorne. So they are people that bought something like Anzac Road 7 years ago for $850, a 3x1, for example, with plans to renovate, and then they've had another kid, building costs have gone up.
Prices have gone up.
Their house is now a 1.7, a 1.8. They've got a lot of equity in it. They've paid a lot of it down, and they think, hold on, building costs, I can buy this for 2.7.
Yeah, take the stress out of it.
So it's a beautiful little ecosystem when you get those.
And we talk about that a lot on this podcast, is that cycling of life stages within suburbs and within clusters of suburbs.
Yeah.
It might be a Tuart Hill to Jundanna to Mount Hawthorne as well.
Stepping stone. That one is a big stepping stone as well. But that top end bracket is, saturated with buyers that live in the area.
Are you seeing any pressure on affordability right now? At any point in the last 3 months versus 6 months ago?
Not really.
No? They're coming cashed up, they're coming with a lot of equity, and they're pre-approved.
Yeah, they're coming pre-approved. The one on Anzac Road was 3 offers at cash offers. The highest, she's picked one of the lower offers because it was cash. At that higher end, I just sold one on the Boulevard, which is in high 2s range now. So on paper, that is groundbreaking data. When the buyers were behaving on it, we only had 2 offers. Okay, if you took that back to August, yes, it may not have been at 2.7, 2.8, but you would have had 4 or 5 offers on it.
So that's a phenomenal point that you've segued me into here, which is something that we're testing in my colleagues' space right now, is having those conversations. And Shane Beaumont mentioned this very recently on the Folio podcast, actually. And he's made it clear that, hey, there used to be 70 people through the home open. Now there's 30. There used to be 15 offers. Now there's 5. And I guess the conversation is testing around, is that the market slowing down, or is it just prices pushing people to a point where less people can be legitimate buyers, but there are still legitimate buyers? There's still multiple offers. It's just because it's that much more expensive, we're reaching higher and higher at the pyramid of who can actually afford this house versus a year ago.
I think so, yeah. And I think the undertone of it as well is the supply issue. So a lot of these people at that level have got a property, and their property has been enjoying the same growth as the rest, so it cancels itself out. Whether it was in August and they bought it for 2.5, their property was probably worth 900. Right now it's worth 1.2. They're buying it for 2.7 plus. So I think it's evening itself out. But those people that aren't at that level, because obviously with a series of offers, you've usually got, if you've got 5 offers, you've got 3 that aren't where your top 2 are, but that gives competitive leverage to increase the top 2 and so on and so forth. But yeah, when you've only got 2, it gets a bit different. It'll be interesting. What I look at is how those numbers are going to continually transcend. If we have,
where does it stop?
Where does it stop?
I think people have been asking that for 3-4 years now, and these are people who have been conditioned to think that Perth's market, for some reason, isn't worthy of continual growth. simply because we believe that Sydney's market, Melbourne's market, Brisbane's markets are arbitrarily better markets than ours. They should be worth more than ours. But people continually forget and continually set aside the reality that it doesn't matter what you call your suburb or your city, if the demand and supply relationship is as chronic as it is, it's going to have an impact that you've never seen before. And seeing obviously is believing for a lot of people, but there's nothing stopping, given median incomes versus those in other states and the demand supply situation versus those in other states, there's nothing stopping Perth ticking into 1.2, 1.25, 1.3 median house price spaces. Simply because we haven't been there before doesn't mean it's not going to happen, as long as we don't solve this supply problem, which you've just referenced.
Exactly. And if anything, might be segueing into another question with everything that's going on as well. From a global point of view, it's increasing building costs, which I think is going to put pressure. It
has to. It's replacement cost theory. We talk about it all the time on the podcast. The more expensive to build the house next door, the more expensive the established one is going to become as a substitute.
So it could have an adverse effect. I think it may have an adverse effect, unless, especially tightly held areas in inner city suburbs where predominant owners are mums and dads
who don't need to sell.
They're not just going to freak out and sell.
Yeah.
So I think they're going to withhold value the best, and if anything could continue to increase if those stock levels. There's no way we're not building more property.
No, and that's a problem. And we continually have the immigration, and that starts to see the market start to mature into places where you do see these more blue chip suburbs in Sydney. You see it in places like Zurich, places like London, where the stock just never goes down because people don't have to sell. And a great example of that, in the last crash in Perth, there were actually 9 suburbs in Perth that didn't go down. One of them, is a great example, was Wembley Downs. Now, the thing about Wembley Downs is it has one of the highest owner-occupier rates in Perth. I think it's about 90%. And there's the nexus, is if you've got people who are invested in the area, whose kids are going to school there, and who don't need to leave and don't have much of a mortgage, they're not going to sell. So you won't see data demonstrating downward pressure because the seller doesn't need to sell more than the buyer needs to buy in that suburb.
Correct, yeah.
So I think this is that new maturity we're seeing in Perth. And it's for those who haven't jumped on board, understanding that it's time people just accept the reality that we haven't solved this problem. And so we're past $1 million now. It was $480,000 pre-COVID, and nothing's to say it doesn't keep going until we finish this.
Yeah.
Why are people selling in Mount Hawthorn?
The lucky ones that have 2 houses and are downsizing. And I think the supply shows it how few people that actually is. I think the biggest thing is the last few that I've had were people that were just the classic real estate, 30 years plus, kids have moved out of home, empty nesters, have a place down south, moving permanently down south with a bolt. They've got a bolt hole in Perth, and the house is too big.
So it's time cashing in,
but only for those that have got the spare house, because I've got a list, as long as both arms combined, where people would happily upsize or downsize into the area, but they don't want to rent and they can't find something to buy.
So they do nothing.
Yeah,
they hold. And
hold. Yeah.
That's what's holding back listings. We still are chronically undersupplied for the reason of supply versus demand, but there is another factor that's holding listings down, and it is this choke point of this path of no return hilly that we've been in for quite a while, where because it's so low on listings and mobility is so bad, there's few options for people who would actually like to sell and put their stock on market, just aren't.
Yeah.
And the data I've got is that would be a factor of 3 to 4 times the stock we've got on market right
100%,
now.
yeah.
And you do that, you've got a balanced market.
Yeah.
But it's like, at what point in time, as stock on market grows, is it 5,000, 6,000 properties? I don't know where that point is, where and it releases enough for people to then go, yeah, bang, I'll put it on the market. And then I think you'll find it will be a much quicker ride from 8,000 properties to 12,000 than it would have been from 3 to 8.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It opens up.
In November, I remember November 2024, we creeped up to
5,500.
5,500. At that time, there were 15 character homes on in Mount Hawthorne, and I saw that every 4x2 was classically trending just above 2 at that point in time. And that would have been a great time to be a buyer. A lot of things transacted.
People getting nervous at that point, though.
They were. And they transacted under that 2 mark. And I remember neither properties were me, but I remember 2 properties coming up, 66 and 65 Buxton. And they're both 4x2s, they're both character. I'm like, at the same time, wouldn't you have had a chat to your neighbour about that? But that's the only time in the last 5 years I've seen that in the market, and the market responded accordingly. Yeah.
You referenced a couple of times now where your sellers have actually chosen a lower offer because of terms that were non-financial.
Yes.
If you could give advice to your best mate who hasn't pulled the trigger yet about how they would get their dream home in Mount Hawthorne and win over those other very serious buyers, how would you fashion their offer?
I would remove the finance clause, 100%. That's the old school Melbourne in me as well, though. And really have a good conversation with the agent around what the seller's needs are. So in terms of, do they need a rent back? Rent backs are huge in Mount Hawthorne, especially if they haven't got a place. Are they looking for longer settlements? Things like that. Big one I'm getting at, and this comes from other outer suburb areas as well, rent backs. You put that as an option in there, and it can give the seller the opportunity. It's not saying you will rent it back, but there's an option to rent the property back. It's a safety rail. That, and a couple of deals I've recently done, both in the area and out the area, have sold slightly under the higher offer because of those options.
We've heard about things like personal letters to the sellers. You ever seen one of them before?
Heaps. I get lots and lots of them.
They work?
Some, yes. I had the last two actually, that properties that I had all had letters on them.
Doesn't hurt, is what you're saying.
Clients didn't read them.
Okay.
Clients didn't read them.
So it doesn't help either.
It doesn't hurt doing it, but it sometimes, especially if you're selling your home, you've been there for 36 years, it's easier to let the numbers talk rather than get these. Some of these have got pictures of their family and their dog, cat on it and all that sort of stuff. And it's a big enough journey for them to let go of something that they've been on without taking the emotional baggage of what someone else is going through. So by all means, put it in there, because sometimes you don't know. Sometimes we don't know the scenario that seller may be in and might just think, you know what, give it to them. So it can't hurt, but sometimes they don't get read.
That's very candid and helpful advice, to be frank, because we do wonder on our side of the fence which ones work, which ones don't. And there is a theme, as you've said. The advice you've given is the theme, and I would suggest for everyone listening, if you're not taking on that advice, which is the same advice that so many other top agents in Perth have given now on this podcast, then what are you doing? Make sure that you've sorted your finance out. Make sure that you're building in pest inspection annexures aren't anything more laborious for the seller than the standard annexure, even if we all understand that they don't really protect you. And make sure that you're that lovable pest that makes it as easy as possible for the selling agent to put you forward.
Couldn't have said it better.
You're a Mount Hawthorne lover, Hamish. What's your favourite street in Mount Hawthorne? If you had all the money in the world to buy into Mount Hawthorne, very quick, why Matlock?
Matlock or the Boulevard, but probably Matlock. It's in the Golden Triangle. It's in the pocket that I would buy Matlock, south of Scarborough Beach Road, between Scarborough Beach Road and Anzac Road. They've got the jacaranda trees, wider street. You go up Matlock, it's only one way out into Scarborough Beach Road. You can't get into it, so you're right in the epicenter of the suburb, but you have no cut-through traffic. Beautiful tree. All the houses are in situ with each other. Yeah, that would be my street.
You heard it first, guys. Matlock is the dress circle street of Mount Hawthorne, and I love the confidence about that. Clearly, you've got your eye on a couple of properties
100%.
yourself.
I'll get there one day.
Hamish Laidlaw, Director at Acton Bell, Mount Hawthorne. Thanks so much for the chat. It's been really insightful. It's an insight that we haven't really heard before, especially with the Melbourne stuff and the candid nature of what's going on the ground in one of Perth's most aspirational suburbs. It's also one of the Perth's most beautiful suburbs. Thanks so much, mate.
Pleasure. Thanks, mate.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!